With the new Black Volt and White Flare Pokemon TCG sets on the horizon, I began thinking about the legacy of the original Black and White era. The Black and White era was one of the craziest times in Pokemon history, bridging the old era and modern era together. But it wasn't a smooth transition at all. In fact, Black and White was the generation that almost destroyed the Pokemon TCG. It began with the changes brought by Black and White. In an effort to simplify the game, the designers began to refocus on aspects of the original era, such as the big basic Pokemon, removal of balances on the player going first, powerful trainer cards, the simplification of effects printed on cards, and the list goes on. The changes to the first turn rules were by far the most impactful and detrimental change made. Throughout the previous 7 years of cards, powerful trainer and supporter cards were limited by not being able to be used on the first turn of the game if you went first. This limitation made it much harder to gain an overwhelming advantage if you went first. In fact, it was often better to go second. There were advantages to going first and second depending on your opening hand though. With Black and White, that was gone. Going first meant no restrictions on the card you could play, and you could even attack. With that, lots of cards that had been printed with prior restrictions in mind became extremely problematic. Compounding these issues was the card named Sableye from Stormfront, which could use its overeager Pokebody to force the player who started it to go first. Now a player could guarantee going first if they could start a Sableye and abuse all of these now broken trainer cards. Pokemon recognized this and stepped in to remove the 2 years worth of Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum cards still left in the game, with the emergency mid-season rotation of 2011, leaving only Heart Gold Soul Silver and the newly released Black and White base set. Throughout the entire Black and White era, these problematic Turn 1 rules continued to plague the game. In early Black and White, low HP Pokemon that were required for some decks to function were very vulnerable to donk cards like Tyrogue, designed to end the game before the opponent even took a turn. Later in Black and White, evolution cards became risky to play as their weaker basics risked being KO'd on the first turn by much more powerful basic attackers like those seen in the big basic decks. That reminds me, the big basics. Nothing defined Black and White more than its big basic Pokemon. Early Black and White was defined by Reshiram and Zekrom, which boasted ridiculously high stats that blew previous big basic Pokemon out of the water. These dragons could repeatedly attack for 120 or more damage. The dragons also packed massive 130 HP totals that made them difficult for anything that isn't another big dragon to take them out. Reshiram dominated the 2011 World Championship format in stellar fashion, while Zekrom became more powerful as the season progressed, gaining allies such as Electric later on. By the end of 2011, most of the metagame was built on big basic decks that tore apart evolution decks quickly, and evolution decks relying on the disgusting Vileplume, which turned off all item cards. While evolution decks never really left the metagame, they were definitely struggling come the end of the year, and especially come 2012, when the new big basic EXs came out. These basic Pokemon worth 2 prize cards boasted even higher stats than behemoths like Reshiram and Zekrom. Mewtwo EX was the initial standout with its 170 HP and its incredibly efficient X-Ball attack, which did 20 damage for each energy attached to both active Pokemon. Power creep was in full force yet again. This attack seems incredibly tame by today's power standards, but this attack was the single most efficient attack in the game during this time, and could be used to knock out your opponent's only Pokemon in play before they even got a turn. While Mewtwo was not uncounterable, its best counter was unfortunately itself, since Mewtwo was weak to Psychic types. If you've been enjoying the video, please do be sure to give it a like. I'd also appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel to keep up with my regular retro content. Anyway, back to Mewtwo. This brought upon the Mewtwo Wars, where many games during this time revolved around trading Mewtwo EX knockouts with your opponent, since if your Mewtwo took a knockout with a double colorless energy attached, it would take very little for your opponent's Mewtwo to return the favor. Mewtwo EX's best friend Darkrai EX would come out the very next set, redefining power creep again. Darkrai EX had the benefit of incredible darkness type based cards that gave it the ability to hit very hard while also spreading bench damage on the opponent's board. It paired very well with Mewtwo EX, while also being a soft check to Mewtwo EX with its psychic resistance. It was quite the beautiful Grim Reaper that quickly put evolution decks in check with its spread damage. The 2012 World Championships showed the newfound power of big basics in this meta, as it was dominated mostly by decks without a single evolved Pokemon in them. Some evolution Pokemon showed promise of being solid attackers, but if you compare the power difference between basics of the previous era and basics of the Black and White era, versus evolutions of the previous era versus Black and White, it was clear that evolution Pokemon were getting the short end of the stick. The 2013 season did show improvement for evolutions though. They were definitely more present throughout the year, but most of them were unfortunately relegated to supporting roles to help big basic EX Pokemon do the talking. Arguably the biggest event for evolutions of the year was when a Selgor Gothitelle, a deck that used multiple Stage 2 Pokemon, would win US Nationals. This deck continued the trend from 2011 and 2012 of evolution decks utilizing item lock to keep up with faster all-basic decks, since these item lock strategies would often win the game once their board was fully established. Klinklang was another of the most successful evolution decks of the year since its Plasma Steel protected all metal Pokemon from the attacks of Pokemon EX. Despite these small successes, evolutions were still held back. Raw numbers were not the only thing holding back most evolutions though during the Black and White era. That can also be attributed to the design of the trainer cards. This started with the nerf to Rare Candy, which was changed to require Pokemon to be in play for a turn before it could be used. I made an entire video to sum this up. Basically, evolutions were much slower than they previously were. If you could KO your opponent's only Piplup in play, it ensured that your opponent was not getting an Empoleon down next turn. While this is an obvious fact of the game now, this was new during Black and White, and it separated Black and White from the generations where Stage 2 evolution Pokemon had defined the game. Another change was the introduction of Pokemon Catcher. Pokemon Catcher is an item card that brings forth one of the opponent's benched Pokemon into the active spot. This is the same effect we have nowadays on Boss's Orders, which is a once per turn supporter card. Being a supporter card limits how powerful this effect can be. Since Pokemon Catcher was an item card, it could be used whenever and for no cost to hunt down benched Pokemon. Pokemon Catcher put one of the most powerful effects in the game in the hands of players whenever they wanted it, recreating that feeling of base set era Pokemon's Gust of Wind trainer card. It's also why many evolution decks had to rely on Vileplume or Gothitelle's item lock to make sure the opponent could not gust them and shut them out of the game quickly. I've also made a video on how Pokemon Catcher changed Pokemon forever, which I also recommend checking out. Another thing to point out about Black and White was the lack of options of trainer cards. This made deck building very stale at times, since nearly every deck was going to be filled out with 4 copies of the most powerful cards. After each deck put some of the most powerful trainer cards of all time in there, they had their choice of wonderfully awful options, since the Black and White sets printed so few options. Cards like Sharon and Bianca of all things saw high level play during mid to late 2012 since there was nothing else until Boundaries Cross came out. Thankfully, some of the trainers introduced by Black and White were really awesome cards like Level Ball and Tool Scrapper, but there was also the ugly ones. Take for example Hypnotoxic Laser, an item card that poisoned the opponent and then on a head flip would also put them to sleep. While the chance of actually sticking a Hypnotoxic Laser sleep was 25%, decks often ran 4 Hypnotoxic Lasers in them, so the chances of losing the game to an unfortunate sleep was a factor in nearly every game. Paired with Hypnotoxic Laser was the mandatory Burbank City Gym, which increased poison damage to being 30 in between turns. Black and White also had the Tropical Beach problem. See, Black and White did have a few really cool Stage 2 Pokemon around, but they were no doubt held back in some way by the necessity of Tropical Beach, an incredible stadium card that allowed players to end their turn, but draw until they had 7 cards in their hand. One big problem is that it was a promo card. Not just any promo card, it was given out at the World Championships in 2011 and 2012. Turns out when you make a staple for evolution decks an extremely limited promo card, tends to affect the game negatively. Even nowadays, Tropical Beach is one of the most expensive cards that's widely played in the expanded format. This was also still at a point in the game's history where the big basic decks weren't going to be cheap either. In a player-dominated market with low pull rate sets, cards like Mewtwo EX demanded up to $70 a copy on release. Thankfully, I was young and dumb not to care about the metagame at the time, but for those who really did, it was not easy. Black and White ended up introducing us to the modern era, with its many full arts, big numbers, and power creep, but the Black and White era was overall a calamitous time in the game's history. The consequences of its bad card design philosophy followed into the X and Y series of sets, where many of these ideas were further expanded upon. It would take all the way until early Sun and Moon before the mistakes of this era felt like they were finally ironed out, and for 2 years they really were. But as we know, that peace did not last long. With the tag teams on the horizon, the game would once again descend into chaos. Thank you all so much for tuning in to the Whimsicast. Do be sure to check out my videos on Pokemon Catcher and Rare Candy, since it will go into more depth on how they changed the game forever. If you want to see more videos talking about the Black and White era or X and Y era, I'd love to talk about them in the future as well. Stay tuned to the Whimsicast, as next time we'll be talking about 2023, Pokemon's modern Golden Age.